In the spring of 1992, in a small Kentucky town where everyone knew everyone's business, a young woman named Jennifer Bailey disappeared from her own home in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She was 23 years old. She had a 2-year-old daughter. She had plans to meet her sister for lunch. When her husband came home from work that evening, he found the front door standing open, her purse on the kitchen counter, her car in the driveway. Jennifer was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no ransom note, just silence. For 3 days the community searched, and then on the 4th day they found her body in a wooded area 12 miles from her home. She had been shot once in the back of the head. The investigation that followed would take 31 years to solve, and when it did, the arrest's WOULD Chinese letter shocked everyone who thought they knew what happened that day. But here's the question that haunted investigators for more than 3 decades. What if the person who knew exactly where to find her was the same person who claimed to be searching for her? The town of Harlan, Kentucky sits deep in the Appalachian Mountains, cradled between steep ridges that hold the morning fog long after sunrise. In 1992, it was a place where coal mining still defined many lives, where families went back generations, where the sound of church bells on Sunday morning carried across the hollow. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner with red vinyl booths, a post office where people stopped to talk. Everyone knew everyone. That was both comfort and curse. Jennifer Marie Bailey grew up 3 streets over from where she would later live as a married woman. She had dark brown hair that she wore long and a laugh that people remembered. She worked part-time at the public library, shelving books and helping children find stories. She had married Michael Bailey when she was 21. He worked at the mine, 3rd shift most weeks. They had a daughter, Emma, who had just turned 2 that March. They lived in a small white house with blue shutters at the end of Maple Street, where the pavement turned to gravel and the woods began. On the morning of April 14, 1992, the sky was overcast. The temperature hovered around 58 degrees. There was a dampness in the air, the kind that made everything feel heavier. Jennifer got up at 7 o'clock. Michael had worked the night shift and was already asleep upstairs. She made coffee in the percolator on the stove. She dressed Emma in pink corduroy overalls and a white turtleneck. She planned to drop Emma at her mother's house, then meet her sister Rachel for lunch at the diner at noon. It was Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday. At 8:30 in the morning, Jennifer's neighbor, Mrs. Pauline Crawford, saw her carrying Emma to the car. Mrs. Crawford was watering her tomato plants. She waved. Jennifer waved back. Mrs. Crawford would later tell investigators that Jennifer seemed perfectly normal. No distress, no hurry, just a young mother going about her day. Jennifer dropped Emma at her mother's house at 8:45. Her mother, Carol Dixon, later stated that Jennifer seemed fine, maybe a little tired. She said she'd pick Emma up around 3 o'clock after lunch and some errands. Carol kissed her daughter on the cheek. Jennifer drove away in her 1988 Honda Accord. At 11:53 in the morning, Rachel Bailey called the library looking for her sister. Jennifer hadn't shown up for lunch. The librarian said Jennifer hadn't come into work that day. She had the day off. Rachel called their mother. Carol said Jennifer had dropped Emma off hours ago and should have been free. Rachel called Jennifer's house. No answer. She called again at 12:15. No answer. At 12:30, she drove to the house herself. The front door was open, not just unlocked, open, standing wide, letting the cool air inside. Rachel walked into the house calling her sister's name. The kitchen light was on. Jennifer's purse sat on the counter, her wallet inside with her driver's license and $23 in cash. Her keys were missing. The coffee pot was still on, the coffee inside burned down to a thick black sludge at the bottom. The television in the living room was on, volume low, showing a soap opera. There was a glass of orange juice on the coffee table, half drunk. The house was silent except for the murmur of the television. Rachel ran upstairs. Michael was asleep in the bedroom, the curtains drawn, the room dark. She shook him awake. He sat up, confused, groggy. "Where's Jennifer?" Rachel asked. Michael looked around the room as if he expected to see her there. He said he didn't know. He'd been asleep since he got home around 7:30 that morning. Rachel told him the front door was open. Jennifer's purse was there, but Jennifer wasn't. Michael got dressed quickly and came downstairs. He walked through the house, calling her name. He went outside and looked in the backyard, in the small storage shed behind the house. Nothing. He came back inside and called the sheriff's office at 1:08 in the afternoon. Deputy Martin Reeves arrived at 1:22. He took down the information. White female, 23 years old, 5'5", 120 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. Last seen around 8:30 that morning by a neighbor. Husband had been asleep. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Vehicle missing. Deputy Reeves noted that the front door had been found open, but there were no scratches on the lock, no broken windows. He asked Michael if they'd had any arguments recently. Michael said no. He asked if Jennifer had seemed upset or worried about anything. Michael said no. She seemed fine. Everything was fine. By 2 o'clock, the search had begun. Sheriff Tom Garrett organized volunteers. They spread out across the property, into the woods behind the house, along the roads leading out of town. Rachel provided a recent photograph. Jennifer smiling, holding Emma on her hip. The photograph was copied and distributed. People taped it to telephone poles, to the windows of stores on Main Street. The local radio station broadcasted a description every hour. Jennifer Bailey, missing since sometime before noon. If you have seen her, call the sheriff's office. Michael Bailey stood in his front yard and spoke to reporters from the local newspaper. He looked directly at the camera. His face was pale. His voice was steady. He said, "Jennifer, if you can hear this, please come home. We love you. Emma needs you." Those who watched later would say he seemed calm. Too calm, some thought. But grief does strange things to people. Shock can look like composure. The search continued into the evening. Flashlights swept through the trees. Volunteers called Jennifer's name into the darkness. Dogs were brought in, given Jennifer's scent from a sweater. They tracked toward the woods but lost the trail near the road. Sheriff Garrett set up a command post in the fire station. Maps were spread across tables. Red pins marked areas already searched. By midnight there was nothing. No trace. No clue. Jennifer Bailey had simply vanished. On the second day, the search expanded. Volunteers came from neighboring towns. The local mining company gave workers time off to help. They searched abandoned buildings, old mine shafts, the banks of the creek that ran through the valley. Divers checked the deeper parts of the water. Helicopter flyovers scanned the ridgelines. Nothing. Sheriff Garrett held a press conference at noon. He stood on the courthouse steps and spoke into a cluster of microphones. He said they were treating this as a possible abduction. They were following every lead. He asked anyone with information to come forward. Michael Bailey appeared beside the sheriff. He was wearing the same clothes as the day before, a plaid flannel shirt and jeans. He had dark circles under his eyes. He said he hadn't slept. He said he just wanted his wife to come home. He said he couldn't understand what had happened. Rachel stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched her brother-in-law as he spoke. Later, she would tell investigators that something felt wrong. She couldn't explain it, just a feeling. The way he kept his hands in his pockets, the way he didn't cry. By the third day, the mood had shifted. Hope was giving way to dread. The volunteers were tired. The dogs had found nothing. Sheriff Garrett began to look more carefully at the husband. It was procedure. In cases like this, you always looked at the husband. Statistics didn't lie. But Michael had an alibi. He'd been at work all night, clocked in at 11:05 the previous evening, clocked out at 7:14 in the morning. Coworkers confirmed it. He'd been underground in the mine. There was no way he could have left and returned without someone noticing. Still, there were inconsistencies, small things. Deputy Reeves noted them in his report. Michael said he'd arrived home at 7:30, but his time card showed 7:14. The drive from the mine to the house took 11 minutes. That left 5 minutes unaccounted for. Michael said he stopped for gas, but when investigators checked, the gas station attendant didn't remember seeing him. Michael said maybe he was mistaken about the time. Maybe it was closer to 7:40 when he got home. But the neighbor, Mrs. Crawford, had seen Jennifer leave with Emma at 8:30. If Michael had arrived home at 7:40, he'd been home for 50 minutes before Jennifer left. Why hadn't she woken him to say goodbye? Why hadn't she mentioned she was leaving? Investigators asked Michael these questions. He sat in the sheriff's office on the evening of the third day, a styrofoam cup of coffee in front of him, untouched. He said he didn't know. He said maybe she didn't want to wake him. He worked hard. He needed sleep. She was considerate like that. Investigators asked if they could search his truck. Michael said yes. They found nothing. No blood. No weapon. The odometer reading matched his story about going straight home from work. On the fourth day, at 2:30 in the afternoon, a hunter named Dale Pritchard was walking his property 12 miles east of Harlan, near the old logging road that hadn't been used in years. He saw something pale in the underbrush. He walked closer. It was a hand. He ran back to his truck and called the sheriff. Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Reeves arrived at 3:05. The body was lying face down in a shallow ravine, partially covered with leaves and branches. She was wearing jeans and a blue sweater. Her shoes were missing. There was a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. The medical examiner later determined she had been dead for approximately 3 days. Time of death estimated between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon on April 14. Jennifer Bailey had been killed within hours of being last seen alive. The crime scene was processed meticulously. Photographs were taken from every angle. The leaves and branches covering her body were collected as evidence. Tire tracks were found on the logging road, approximately 50 yards from where the body was discovered. Plaster casts were made. The tracks belonged to a common tread pattern found on thousands of trucks in the area. No shell casing was recovered at the scene. The bullet, a .38 caliber, was removed during the autopsy. Ballistics analysis showed it had been fired from a revolver, but without the weapon, there was no way to match it. Michael Bailey was brought in for questioning again. He sat across from Sheriff Garrett in the same chair in the same room. This time, his hands were shaking. The sheriff told him they'd found Jennifer. Michael closed his eyes. He asked how. The sheriff told him, shot in the back of the head, dumped in the woods. Michael put his head in his hands. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was barely a whisper. He said he didn't know who would do this. He said Jennifer didn't have enemies. Everyone loved her. The sheriff asked him if he owned a gun. Michael said yes. A hunting rifle. The sheriff asked if he owned a handgun. Michael hesitated, then he said yes, a .38 revolver. He kept it in the glove compartment of his truck for protection. The sheriff asked to see it. Michael said he'd look for it. He wasn't sure where it was. He hadn't seen it in a while. The sheriff asked when he'd last seen it. Michael said he couldn't remember, maybe a few weeks ago, maybe a month. The sheriff asked Michael to account for his whereabouts on the morning of April 14, from the time he left work until the time Rachel arrived at the house. Michael repeated what he'd said before. He clocked out at 7:14. He drove straight home. He arrived around 7:30, maybe 7:40. He went upstairs. He went asleep. He woke up when Rachel shook him awake around 1 o'clock. The sheriff asked if anyone could verify that he'd been asleep. Michael said no. Jennifer was gone. He was alone. The sheriff leaned forward. He asked Michael if he'd killed his wife. Michael looked up, his face flushed. He said no, absolutely not. He loved her. The sheriff asked him again. Michael's voice rose. He said he didn't kill her. He would never hurt her. The sheriff let the silence sit between them. Then he told Michael he was free to go, but not to leave town. In the days that followed, investigators retraced Michael's route from the mine to his house. They drove it themselves, timing it, 11 minutes. They drove from the house to the logging road where Jennifer's body was found, 23 minutes. They calculated. If Michael had left work at 7:14, driven home, killed his wife, driven her body to the logging road, dumped it, and returned home, he would have needed at least an hour. But Rachel had seen Jennifer alive at 8:30. The timeline didn't work. Unless Jennifer had returned home after dropping Emma off. Unless something had happened then. But there was another problem. Jennifer's car was still missing. If Michael had killed her at the house, how had he gotten her body to the logging road? He couldn't have used his truck. Coworkers would have noticed if he'd left the mine parking lot and returned with mud on his tires, branches caught in the undercarriage. And Jennifer's car was gone. Someone had taken it. Someone had driven it away from the house. If Michael had killed her, where was the car? 5 days after Jennifer's body was found, her Honda Accord was discovered in a grocery store parking lot in the neighboring town of Pineville, 28 miles away. The keys were in the ignition. The interior was clean. No fingerprints except Jennifer's. No blood. No sign of struggle. The gas tank was nearly empty. Sheriff Garrett stood beside the car and looked at the odometer. It showed an additional 41 miles since Jennifer's mother had last noted the reading when Jennifer had visited the week before. 41 miles. Not enough to account for multiple trips. Just enough for one trip from Harlan to the logging road, and from the logging road to Pineville. Investigators returned to Michael Bailey. They asked him if he'd ever been to that grocery store in Pineville. He said maybe once or twice. They asked him if he had any connection to that area. He said no. They asked him again about the gun. Michael said he'd looked everywhere. He couldn't find it. He thought maybe someone had stolen it from his truck. When? He wasn't sure. He hadn't noticed it was missing until the sheriff asked about it. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves. The husband's gun was missing. The husband couldn't account for 5 minutes of his mourning. The husband showed no emotion at the funeral, held on a gray Saturday morning while rain fell steadily on the umbrellas of mourners. Michael Bailey stood beside the casket, his face blank, his eyes dry. Those who knew him said he'd always been stoic. Others said it was unnatural. A man whose wife had been murdered should weep. But without physical evidence, without a witness, without the murder weapon, the case stalled. The district attorney reviewed the file and said there wasn't enough to charge anyone. The timeline was problematic. The car had been driven by someone, but there was no proof it was Michael. The gun was missing, but there was no proof it was the murder weapon. They needed more. They needed something definitive. Weeks turned into months. The investigation slowed. Tips came in, each one leading nowhere. A man claimed he'd seen Jennifer arguing with someone at a gas station the day she disappeared. Investigators checked. It wasn't Jennifer. A woman called to say her ex-boyfriend had confessed to killing someone in Kentucky in 1992. Investigators interviewed him. He'd been in prison in another state when Jennifer died. One by one, the leads dried up. The case went cold. For Michael Bailey, life continued. He went back to work at the mine. His daughter, Emma, stayed with her grandmother during the day. On weekends, Michael picked her up and brought her home. Neighbors saw them at the park, at the grocery store. Emma growing taller, her hair the same dark brown as her mother's. Michael never remarried. He kept the house on Maple Street, kept Jennifer's photographs on the mantle. To the outside world, he was a grieving widower raising his daughter alone. But those close to the family saw cracks. Carol Dixon, Jennifer's mother, grew distant from Michael. She stopped inviting him to family gatherings. She asked to keep Emma more often. When asked why, she would only say that something didn't sit right with her. Rachel, Jennifer's sister, stopped speaking to Michael altogether. At Emma's 3rd birthday party held at Carol's house, Michael arrived and Rachel left through the back door. The family fractured along invisible lines. those who believed Michael was innocent, those who believed he knew more than he'd said. By 1995, Michael had moved out of Harlan. He took a job at a mine in Virginia 3 hours away. He took Emma with him. Carol Dixon fought for custody but lost. The court ruled that Michael was the child's father and there was no evidence he was unfit. Carol was granted visitation rights. Every other weekend, she drove the 6-hour round trip to see her granddaughter. Emma was quiet. She drew pictures in crayon, mostly houses and trees. Sometimes she drew a woman with long brown hair. When Carol asked who it was, Emma said, "Mama." The years passed. 1996, 1998, 2000. The case file sat in a storage room at the sheriff's office, one box among hundreds. Occasionally, a new deputy would pull it out, read through the reports, wonder if there was something that had been missed. But the evidence was thin. The witnesses were few. The trail had gone cold decades ago. In 2003, Emma Bailey was 13 years old. She was in the 7th grade. She lived with her father in a small town in Virginia where no one knew about her mother's murder. She was a quiet girl, polite, good at math. She kept to herself. She had nightmares sometimes. Dreams where she was small again, where she heard shouting, where she saw her father's face close to hers, angry, telling her to be quiet. She would wake up gasping, her father standing in her doorway asking if she was okay. She always said yes. That fall, Emma's school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Dunn, noticed that Emma seemed withdrawn. She asked Emma to come to her office. They sat across from each other in chairs with soft cushions, a box of tissues on the table between them. Mrs. Dunn asked if everything was okay at home. Emma nodded. Mrs. Dunn asked if Emma wanted to talk about anything. Emma was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I remember things, but I don't know if they're real." Mrs. Dunn leaned forward gently. She asked what kind of things. Emma looked down at her hands. She said she remembered being very small, maybe 2 or 3 years old. She remembered being in a car. She remembered her mother crying. She remembered her father yelling. She remembered stopping somewhere, trees all around. She remembered her mother getting out of the car. She remembered her father getting out too. She remembered hearing a loud noise. She remembered being alone in the car, scared, crying, and then her father getting back in and driving. She remembered him telling her it was a dream, that she'd had a bad dream, that Mama was gone but she'd be okay. Mrs. Dunn asked Emma if she'd ever told anyone this before. Emma shook her head. She said her father told her it was just a nightmare, that it wasn't real, but it felt real. It felt like a memory. Mrs. Dunn told Emma she was very brave for sharing this. She asked if it would be okay to call someone who could help. Emma asked who. Mrs. Dunn said someone who investigates things like this. Someone who could find out the truth. 2 days later, Virginia State Police Detective Laura Henderson sat down with Emma Bailey in the same office. Emma repeated what she'd told the counselor. Detective Henderson took notes. She asked Emma if she remembered what kind of trees were around them. Emma said tall ones, pine trees maybe. She asked if Emma remembered what her mother was wearing. Emma closed her eyes. She said a blue shirt. She asked if Emma remembered what happened after the loud noise. Emma said her father came back to the car. He was breathing hard. He told her to be quiet. He drove for a long time. Then they were home. Then everything was confusing, people everywhere, her grandmother crying. Detective Henderson contacted the Harlan County Sheriff's Office. The case file was pulled from storage. Sheriff Tom Garrett had retired. Deputy Martin Reeves was now sheriff. He read through the old reports, the photographs, the witness statements. He read about the missing gun, the unexplained timeline, the car found 28 miles away. He read the note he'd written in the margin of one page. Check if victim's daughter was in the vehicle. No one had checked. Emma had been at her grandmother's house, or so everyone assumed. But what if Jennifer had gone back to get her? What if there had been an argument? What if Emma had been there the whole time? Sheriff Reeves called Detective Henderson. He asked if Emma could remember anything else, specific details, times, places. Detective Henderson spoke to Emma again. This time, Emma remembered more. She remembered her father stopping the car and getting out with her mother. She remembered watching through the window. She remembered seeing her mother walk into the trees. She remembered her father following. She remembered the loud sound. She remembered her father coming back alone, his hands shaking. She remembered him driving to her grandmother's house and dropping her off. She remembered him telling her grandmother that Jennifer had dropped Emma off earlier that morning. She remembered her grandmother believing him. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, you know the weight of that doubt. It sits in your chest. It makes you question your own memory. It makes you wonder if you're inventing things, if your mind is playing tricks. Emma Bailey lived with that doubt for 11 years. She carried the weight of a memory she'd been told was a dream. And now, at 13 years old, she was being asked to remember details that could send her father to prison. In December 2003, investigators reopened the case. Detective Henderson and Sheriff Reeves traveled to Virginia and interviewed Michael Bailey. He sat in the same kind of interview room he'd sat in 11 years earlier, older now, grayer. They told him his daughter had made a statement. They told him what she'd said. Michael stared at them. He said Emma was confused. She was a baby when her mother died. She didn't remember anything. She was making it up. Maybe someone had put ideas in her head. Detective Henderson asked him if he'd taken Emma with him the morning Jennifer died. Michael said no. He said Emma had been at her grandmother's house. Detective Henderson asked him if he was sure. Michael said yes, absolutely sure. She asked him if Jennifer had gone back home to get Emma after dropping her off. Michael said no. That didn't make sense. She asked him why Jennifer's car had been found 28 miles away when she was supposed to meet her sister for lunch 3 blocks from her house. Michael said he didn't know. He'd never understood that part either. Sheriff Reeves placed a photograph on the table. It was the crime scene photo, Jennifer's body in the ravine. He asked Michael if he recognized the location. Michael looked away. He said no, he'd never been there. Sheriff Reeves said they'd measured the distance from Michael's house to that logging road, 23 minutes. He said they'd measured the distance from that logging road to Carol Dixon's house, 16 minutes. He said they'd measured the distance from Carol Dixon's house to the grocery store parking lot in Pineville where Jennifer's car was found, 31 minutes. He said if someone had driven that route, dropping a body, dropping off a child, abandoning a car, it would take about an hour and 10 minutes. He said that matched the timeline perfectly. He said Michael had clocked out at 7:14. He said Mrs. Crawford had seen Jennifer leave at 8:30. He said that was 76 minutes. Michael Bailey sat very still. He said he didn't kill his wife. He said he loved her. Detective Henderson asked him if he owned a .38 revolver. Michael said he used to. He said it had been stolen. She asked when. He said he didn't remember exactly. She asked if he'd filed a police report. He said no. She asked why not. He said he hadn't thought it was important. They arrested Michael Bailey on December 18, 2003. He was charged with first-degree murder. Bond was set at $500,000. He remained in custody. The news spread quickly. In Harlan, people who remembered the case gathered at the diner, at the post office, at the hardware store. Some said they'd always known. Others said it was impossible. Michael Bailey had been a good father. He'd raised his daughter alone. He'd never hurt anyone. The trial was set for June 2004. Emma Bailey, now 14 years old, would be the primary witness for the prosecution. Her testimony would be the key to everything. For months, she worked with a child psychologist, reconstructing her memories, separating what she truly remembered from what she'd been told. The psychologist testified later that Emma's memories were consistent, detailed, and showed no signs of coaching or fabrication. She believed Emma was telling the truth. On June 14, 2004, Emma Bailey took the stand. The courtroom was packed. Michael Bailey sat at the defense table, wearing a suit, his face expressionless. Emma didn't look at him. She looked at the prosecutor, a woman named Susan Alvarez, who asked her to describe what she remembered from April 14, 1992. Emma spoke quietly. She said she remembered being in the car with her mother. She said her mother was crying. She said her father was driving. She said he was yelling. She said they stopped on a dirt road in the woods. She said her mother got out. She said her father got out. She said she stayed in the car. She said she heard a loud bang. She said her father came back alone. She said he was breathing hard. She said he told her, "Mama's gone, don't cry, it was an accident." She said he drove to her grandmother's house. She said he told her grandmother that her mother had dropped her off that morning. She said she didn't say anything because she was scared. The defense attorney, a man named Robert Carver, cross-examined Emma. He asked if she'd been coached. She said no. He asked if her grandmother had told her what to say. She said no. He asked if she was sure these were real memories and not dreams. She said she was sure. He asked her why she hadn't said anything for 11 years. Emma looked at him. She said, "Because my father told me it was a dream, and I wanted to believe him." The prosecution presented additional evidence. They presented the odometer readings, the timeline, the missing gun. They presented testimony from a forensic psychologist who explained that it was possible for a child to repress traumatic memories and recall them later. They presented Carol Dixon, who testified that Michael had dropped Emma off at 9:45 on the morning of April 14, not 8:30 as Jennifer had planned. She said she'd always thought it was strange, but hadn't questioned it at the time. The defense argued that Emma's memories were false. They argued that she'd been influenced by media coverage, by her grandmother's suspicions, by detectives who wanted to solve a cold case. They argued that there was no physical evidence linking Michael to the crime. The gun was never found. No forensic evidence placed him at the scene. They argued that Michael Bailey was innocent and that his daughter, traumatized by the loss of her mother, had created a narrative to make sense of the senseless. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On June 29, 2004, they returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Michael Bailey showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead. Emma, sitting in the gallery with her grandmother, closed her eyes. Michael Bailey was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence. He appealed the conviction, arguing that Emma's testimony was unreliable, that it should not have been admitted. The appeal was denied. He remains incarcerated at a maximum security facility in Kentucky. Emma Bailey, now in her 30s, lives a private life. She has spoken publicly only once, in a 2019 interview with a local newspaper. She said that telling the truth was the hardest thing she'd ever done. She said she still loved her father, but she couldn't let him get away with what he'd done to her mother. She said she hoped her mother knew that justice had been served. She said she thought about her mother every day. In the end, this case is about more than murder. It's about memory and truth. It's about a child who carried a terrible secret for 11 years, who was brave enough to speak when the world was ready to listen. It's about a woman named Jennifer Bailey, who was 23 years old, who loved her daughter, who went to meet her sister for lunch and never came home. It's about the investigators who never stopped believing that the truth would surface. And it's about a community that learned that sometimes the person you trust most is the person you should have questioned. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.